Hello, and welcome to the NYU Game Center's lecture series, an ongoing series of events where we bring a variety of different guests to you from near and far across different sectors of the game industry. And I am Naomi Clark. I'm one of the full-time faculty at the Game Center, and it's my tremendous pleasure and honor to be introducing a very old friend of mine tonight, Latoya Peterson. And so I'm going to tell you the story of how Latoya and I first met, which was all the way back in 2010. Even without a pandemic, it might feel like a long time ago. We somehow ended up on a panel at the South by Southwest Interactive Festival talking about race in games. And this was back in the day when I don't think I had ever attended any kind of event where people were talking about the intersection of those two things. But it was me and Latoya Peterson and Ngai Kroll, who was also had made a name for himself, sort of taking on the contentious issue of portrayal of Black people in games, which was something that like nobody was talking about at that point. Latoya at the time was the editor-in-chief of a renowned website called Racialicious, which had been on my radar as one of the only like really intelligent websites talking about pop culture and race and how those issues intersected, right? And she had also invited me to be on a roundtable about interracial dating, and so that was another thing that we did together back in 2010. I'm like having all of these memory flashbacks now. It was, yeah, that was back when I was oddly enough a blogger and I was writing video game reviews. Latoya also did a lot of interesting coverage back in the early days when there really weren't a lot of websites writing about games other than just doing product reviews, right? Interesting critical writing about games, thinking about the culture of games and how games impact culture was pretty thin on the ground. And so Latoya was one of the groundbreakers there because she took Racialicious, which was talking a lot about other media, right? A lot about film and TV, and said, hey, we had to talk about games too. In fact, I think she was one of the first people who I was aware of who came from this whole world outside of games as a journalist, as an editor, as a writer, but she was really interested in games. She wasn't, sort of from within the game industry trying to promote it outwards, but she was genuinely someone who played a lot of games, was aware of the problems in games, was definitely not just some kind of super fan, wanted to talk about it critically, and wanted to sort of get involved with people in the game industry who were talking about it as well. So I was really excited when her career just continued to intersect with games. Right, she went on to be the deputy editor for digital innovation at ESPN's The Undefeated. Then she was an editor at large for Fusion. She was a senior digital producer for Al Jazeera America's The Stream. And then in 2016, I got to briefly collaborate with her again. I was one of many female game developers and creators who were interviewed for a series that she did for YouTube on Girl Gamers. And she just went on like continuing to cover games, criticize games, look at the culture of games, look at the culture of esports as a journalist and editor and curator and critic. She's written for all sorts of venues: Teen Vogue, NPR, the New York Times, Washington Post, Essence, Spin, Vibe, Marie Claire, Kotaku, The Atlantic, The Guardian, goes on and on, right? She serves on the advisory board of a bunch of different institutes, including DSI, the John S. Knight Journalism Foundation fellowships. I could continue rattling off her credentials, but here is one of the most interesting things and one of the big reasons we wanted to ask her to come and talk about race in games today. It's that Latoya has gone from being someone who's thinking critically about games, writing about the world of games, looking at the culture of games as a filmmaker, a documentarian, editor, and writer, and she's jumped over the fence to becoming a creator of games. And she's done that by founding the Glow Up Games, along with the NYU Game Center's very own Mitu Kondaker. So Latoya is the Chief Experience Officer, as well as the Director for the Culture. And Glow Up Games is a startup working on a new mobile game, which I'm sure you will hear about shortly from Latoya, if you have not heard about it already. They are a company that was founded entirely by women of color, and their strategy is built around like tackling new audiences and new subjects in games, and making partnerships with new forms of media that really have not been tapped in games as well. So okay, I'll stop rattling on. I just really wanted to give huge shout outs to Latoya as someone who I feel like has had my back for a really long time working games, and someone who's never stopped paying attention to how games portray race, to how people of color are working in games. She's always been there for honestly for all of us who are struggling to find our way in games as people of color and as women. So I want to hear her thoughts on exactly what's behind the endless struggle for diversity in games. So I'm just going to turn it over to her. Please take it away, Latoya, and much love.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I'm like blushing at this thing. It's an awesome full circle moment for me because you were the first game designer I ever actually met. I was following all of your posts on Feministe, and I was like, what an interesting career path that could be. How strange. And it's interesting now that, you know, as things have played out, like back in that day, Jesus, we had no idea. And now, like, I feel like I'm like semi part of this NYU mafia that you guys have built, because like I'm good friends with Matt Bach. Dr. Ken Daker is my co-founder, also homegirl. Like it's just been, I'm around game developers long enough where I guess you guys just kind of pulled me in via osmosis.
Yeah, we like you.
Come on, it's gonna be fine.
Come hang out with us, make some games, and then little did you know. I
know, shark in the water. You could have warned me about it. So yeah, so thank you all so much, and I think you're supposed to thank some sponsors, Naomi, before we start.
Oh my God, I got so carried away. Thank you, Latoya. Always thinking about the business side of things too. Really sharp. I don't know what I would do without you. I do have to thank our sponsors that make this event series possible and allow us to bring all these amazing speakers to talk with all of us and with you guys. The event sponsors for the lecture series are Fresh Planet, Take-Two Interactive, Empire State Development, and Parsec. Thanks so much to all of you for making this possible. All right, now I'm done, and you can totally take it away.
Love it. Okay. So let's just jump right into it, right? Because this is, I think a few NYU students have heard me lecture at I've been in and around the industry for a very long time, probably starting in 2000. And one of the first ones that I know of, and all Robin Fleming and Andrea Rubinstein, who went by Takanji. It's still like back in that day, it's handles. So I was like, oh yeah, Takanji and Robin can't jump. But anyway, and so they had. Okay. So are we good? And we're live. Perfect. Okay. So just starting again. So I started writing about games officially in 2006 because of a woman-fronted network called the Iris Network, which does not exist anymore. It's Digital Dust, run by Andrea Rubinstein and Robin Fleming, who were creating this thing, and they created this magazine essentially for women who like the game called Cerise. And so I wrote all kinds of just random stuff I didn't think anybody was going to care about. This is about, like, you know, various representations, Grand Theft Auto, all this random stuff I was thinking of. And we never got paid for any of this work. Like, remember, this is the early days of the internet. This was pre-brand, pre-streaming, pre-social media even. So when we started, or when I joined up with Racialicious, so Racialicious was actually first a site called Mixed Media Watch that was co-founded by Carmen Van Kerkhove and Jen Chow, who are both mixed race Asian. And then I came in as editor right around the time they converted to Racialicious to talk about mixed race issues in a more kind of broad way. And so again, it's that mix that Naomi described of race and pop culture. We talked about television, we talked about books, we talked about literature, we talked about news, but also because I'm a player and a gamer, I've been playing since I was 6 years old. I was like, okay, let's talk about these other issues and this other stuff that I've seen. However, I normally describe my career as games adjacent. So I'm actually have not been in the industry until very recently. Most of what I was doing was commentary on the side while I worked my day job, and my day job was in mainstream media. So I was a blogger back in the days when that was cool. Like, this was back when WordPress was still on version 2. So like that's when we transferred from Zynga to WordPress. That's how long ago this was. That's when Twitter was pretty new and still debuting at South by Southwest. All of these things hadn't yet happened. But I was writing about race and culture in different ways and looking at the outsized impact on communities of color around portrayals of race, particularly in news and media, but also in pop culture and stereotypes. So eventually I was a blogger. I wrote for all of those different places as a freelancer. I became a radio host for a little while and kept guest hosted Michael Eric Dyson show, frequent guest on NPR. And then from there started doing television and television hosting. So this photo up here at the top was me actually as a digital producer on Al Jazeera America's The Stream, but I had also been a guest host many times on their international version of the show, which was a really fun and wild ride. That was during the Arab Spring. That was, that was before Twitter social media was taken seriously. Back when newsrooms would ask questions like, how can you trust a tweet? Or, how can you say anything newsworthy in 140 characters? So we were at the forefront of what could be accomplished and what could be done. And while I was at Jazeera, one of the things that I loved was this idea of this global impact of gaming and having an understanding of like, okay, well, if we're looking at retention, if we're looking at engagement, we really should be learning from video games in the news industry because we're fighting for minutes and video games normally count in hours in terms of engagement. And so I thought there was a lot that the news media could learn from game mechanics and from rollouts. And so I did a lot of talks at the Online News Association, other places like NABJ, which is the National Association for Black Journalists, and places like that around, how we can integrate these things. However, I've also had a love of technology and just all kinds of playfulness. And so my career has taken me many different places and allowed me to dabble in all kinds of things. There's me at Pixar with my good friend, Bob Whitehill. He's the stereoscopic 3D supervisor there. But we had collaborated on some projects while I was at ESPN, and it was very fun to be part of the Disney fam because they do take technology very, very seriously. And I got to really enhance my understanding of VR and AR technologies from the producer's perspective, and then figure out how to do things. Disney also taught me artificial intelligence and AI. And it was the first time I was in their VR working group across company, and they're like, hey, Latoya, why don't you come over and try to do this thing? And so, I didn't know anything about artificial intelligence. I especially didn't know how it worked, but the people who taught me were game designers, right? Were people who were speaking my language. I didn't understand necessarily computer science. I was never very strong in math for various reasons. I'll explain that later. But game developers explained it in such a way that I could understand it. And so people like Alex Champinard were just amazing when I was starting my early walk in AI, Mitu, obviously, and other folks, to the point where I actually went to NVIDIA for a training and actually deployed a neural network. Like I have this also down at the right corner. There is an organization called Blacks in AI that tries to advance, I'll talk about them a little bit more later, that advances people of color in artificial intelligence and really does an advocacy worldwide for more of us going into the field. And they brought me to a conference called NeurIPS, which is one of the big AI conferences, Neural Information Processing Systems, where I presented a concept project called AI in the Trap that we were working on around these different social norms of kind of what the social norm would be for artificial intelligence and computer science, and social norms of the hood, which is normally a very different idea around surveillance and surveillance culture. And this was also like the crew down here at the Undefeated where I started working with esports. So when I landed at ESPN after all these years of writing and talking about video games, I had actually written a huge piece for ESPN, the magazine's esports issue, not knowing anything about esports, but they wanted a woman's voice in the mag. And so a friend of mine saw me hate tweeting a book about games on the plane, which we can also talk about later. And I was like, oh, let's let you play video games. Do you want to write about this? So a few years later, I actually ended up joining ESPN. And the first thing, I got off the plane in Bristol and they're like, hey, come meet the other gamers. What are you doing? Come over here. So that's where I started learning about esports. I wrote a piece that went semi-viral. It was getting picked up at least even 3 years after I wrote it, called Why Don't More Black Kids Go Pro in Esports? We're looking at some of the structural issues around what's in the developing esports economy. And did a lot of pieces, particularly around Rick Fox's team, Echo Fox, before it collapsed. So it was really interesting being on like the forefront of both reporting and doing kind of like, you know, journalism around world events, which is really where my training came from. And then also being able to apply that to the games industry. But as I mentioned before, I also wrote quite a bit. Racialicious was hacked in 2015. It's hacked so bad that Google has us delisted. Like, we have a very deep root hack, and I wish I could be like, oh, it was white supremacists who were trying to take us out. It was like Ugg boots. It was awful. But anyway, so we have this huge hack. But I wrote quite a bit for other sites as well. I used to write for Jezebel back in the day, and Brian Crescente, who was the editor of Kotaku at the time, would normally pull my stuff over to Kotaku. And so wrote quite a few pieces about like sexism and character design, gender gaming and stereotypes, you know, things that are happening when we're looking at this idea of who gets to play and who is actually a gamer. And so, you know, I also use the term gamer. A lot of folks, particularly in the Girl Gamers documentary that Naomi had mentioned, which is interesting because that came out 2015. And now the girl gamer identity has really shifted online to something very sexual, which I was like, this is really interesting. If there's a girl gamer tag on TikTok, the content you're getting is very different than like what we were talking about back in the day. But the idea was to talk about women who are playing, particularly at the height of Gamergate, and harassment was the only story and the only narrative that the media was telling about women in games. And I remember just being so frustrated, even like just reading articles. And like I was reading an article about an esports coach, and this woman is kind of like coaching this elite team. And the only thing the article ever talked about was the harassment she faced. They never even talked about like why she got into the sport, why she was interested, how she became a coach, what are her favorite games. Nothing about her story was revealed. And so one of the reasons that I had went into media management, after being a freelancer for many years, I ended up doing a fellowship at Stanford called the John S. Knight Fellowship, which is for distinguished journalists to come in and like, you know, kind of take a year to think about reinventing journalism. Now I'm on the board of that same fellowship, but I did a JSK fellowship at Stanford and really spent that time kind of steeped in Silicon Valley, thinking about product, thinking about launches, and thinking about management, because ultimately what we're talking about are transitions of power and looking at who can tell what stories and when. So that's the lens that I normally approach media through. Race in games actually has not progressed as much as I would have hoped in the last, 10, 15 years. Naomi mentioned the panel that we were all on at South by Southwest at this event called Screen Burn. So this is again back when South by Southwest wanted to have a whole panel about video games and looking at the future of interactive entertainment. And we actually titled that talk, You Got Our Social Justice in Your Video Game, right? Like we talked about explicitly social justice in games and race and gender. And at the end of the day, we all got barbecue and went home, like nothing happened. So the shifts that have happened in culturally since that panel, since before those times, were not things that were always here. And I think people always associate discourse around gaming and conversations around gaming and actual critical conversations around gaming with toxicity and harassment, because that's what they've seen after kind of like this more organized push starting about 2014, 2015. But one of the places in which we really wanted to work, and one of the, I guess, watershed moments for discussing race in video games online, because before then it was very hard to get any kind of traction. And even now, if you search and you're looking for scholarly works on race in video games, you come up with very, very little individual articles, individual blog posts, but not too many like large works in the way that you would if you saw gender in games or any kind of stories of how large games came about. I chose this still graphic from Resident Evil 5 because that was a big watershed moment and turning point, particularly for those of us who wrote about race in games. Capcom had kind of unleashed a perfect storm of kind of racism, colonialism, sexism in one game. And they seemed completely oblivious to it. Their press team came out and they were just thrilled at this new out of Africa story that they were putting together. And they were like, this is just a fantastic, we've done a survival horror game that uses light, and just completely forgot about all of the other tropes that they were playing into, including kind of like this whole idea of a savage, this whole idea of, who is considered acceptable, particularly in the character. I mean, you can do an entire thesis, honestly, on this game, particularly the character of Sheva Alomar and how she is marked differently from the other Blacks in the game, how she's given a British accent, how she has lighter eyes. There's so many things you could analyze. And even in her character, how like in the trailer, she's literally introduced, but first, as a sexual object for Redfield. There's Chris Redfield's talk in the trailer where he was like, oh, I've got a job to do and I got to do it, like this whole white man's burden thing come to life. So there were many other games we discussed through this lens. We talked about Little Big Planet. We talked about Shadow Hearts Covenant. We talked about so many different games. We talked about Turok. There were lots of different games that we were looking at through a critical lens alongside other bloggers, again, like Naomi, but also like great blogs like Girl in the Machine that doesn't exist anymore. Bomber Girl, Token Minorities was a really great one. And No More Lives, that was a Yusun's blog. But like these other in Microscopic. So there were many other people who were writing about games, as well as N-Guy, who was at Newsweek at the time. And so we wrote about this, and what was interesting, particularly for the reaction to race in Resident Evil 5, was this idea that one, we shouldn't be talking about this at all, that race was so taboo, it wasn't something that we should touch in the realm of video games. And it was all just, just ridiculous pandering. But also, particularly when N-Guy wrote about it, because N-Guy was a known name then, a very trusted name in video games journalism. And the hurt from like young white gamers who were going, well, wait, I thought you were our side. I thought you understood video games. How could you attack this thing that we love? How could you put yourself on this side? And I mean, like, N-Guy's commentary was mild compared to a lot of the other stuff we were seeing. But there was a lot that came out of the race in Resident Evil 5 discourse that was happening online. And then one of the most notable things is that it was kind of what I would mark as the Proto Gamergate incident, in which a blogger, Sakari from a blog called Black Looks, was one of the first people to receive that kind of like targeted brigading from gamers, saying they would kill her, sending her all these kind of death threats and things like that, way before these things started happening to the other developers who were at the core of who were targeted by the Gamergate controversy. So before that kind of organized mass, we'd seen it organized other places and in other spaces online, particularly in the UX and development community. But that was the first time we had seen it cross over into games. And that's kind of a footnote. Most people don't remember that even happened. Sakari, for what it's worth, took her blog down completely for about a year and just kind of recovered, and then, rebooted, retooled. And so Black Looks now exists as like an archive. But it's really interesting to see, like, that was kind of a flashpoint that none of us had seen before. And we had seen smaller incidents, not very organized, but that was kind of the first one that was going to be like the premonition of things to come. So there's a lot of work to be done in general around racing games, around the topic of racing games. The shirt I'm wearing tonight is in honor of Dr. Jerry Lawson, who invented the first games cartridges for the Fairchild F cartridge, I believe, for an initial game system. Dr. Lawson's contributions are huge. And then there was a wonderful scholar named Javon who gave a talk at MagFest all about the stuff that they learned about Dr. Lawson's career and what was going on in game development. But there's a lot that is still kind of unknown and uncovered or unrecorded about particularly Blacks in gaming, but people of color at large. In fact, in large part because the industry just kind of doesn't want to deal with it or think about it. So one of the ways in which Naomi asked me to think about this talk was around kind of this dual perspective that I have. For one, being on the critic side of the fence for so many different years and looking at how these things were going, looking at the conversations, talking to developers, doing reporting, figuring those things out, and then flying over and jumping over the fence to becoming a creator of games and figuring these things out. And so I think the biggest fallacy that I think I held as a critic that I no longer hold as a creator is game development is a science, right? It's a very noble process with predictable inputs which will result in the desired outcome. And so that's kind of broad to the category at large, right? If you make a game, it seemed like from the outside, everyone knew what was happening. Everyone knew what they were doing. Everyone was like, these were all seasoned professionals who knew how to wrestle a story and craft play and make these really fun experiences time and time again and do it repeatably. And it was just all like this dark art that just none of us understood because we just didn't have the tools. We didn't know how to do it. And in that vein is how we talked about diversity in games, right? This idea that if we have these predictable inputs, okay, well, if we just add more diverse developers, if we just create more opportunities for developers at the front of the pipeline, if we look at the pipeline problem, if we fix this or fix that, then what will come out automatically will be more diverse characters, will be better representations, will be less stereotypes. These things can be predicted. There's an input and there needs to be an output. So I think when I think back on the critic that I was and the writer that I was, and still am sometimes, occasionally I will write something these days about games. My career kind of moved when I became a television producer. So I write dramatically less than I used to. I did do a piece recently with Samus, who is our audio designer and art director, about like kind of Black feminist play and thinking about game design systems. But again, like, I don't write the way that I used to. However, had I been still writing for Kotaku, still writing for Jezebel, still in these spaces, the Square Enix announcement would have just filled me with joy. Like, this is progress. This is such progress. We have 2 women of color headlining 2 of the biggest game launches in 2021. Things have changed. Look at all this new representation. Back when I gave the talk that Naomi was referencing, the one about social justice, I had mentioned how many times as a Black woman, I could play as someone that looked like me. And I counted 12, right? Which sparked the whole conversation in the blogosphere. I think people ended up with like 15 or so characters. And that's also counting characters that appeared to be Black, but were not necessarily Black by canon, or not necessarily African-American by canon. So we were counting people like Fran, the Viera from Final Fantasy, who is a bunny girl and an alien technically, but also dark skinned. At least we have that. We're counting folks like Alex Vance from the Half-Life series. And Alex Vance canonically is mixed, right? She's Korean and Black, but we're counting her as a Black character. And then there's Jade from Beyond Good and Evil, which became like this racial test of like who is going to claim Jade at any given moment. But if I had seen this in 2012 or 2013 or 2014 when I was still writing about games, I would have just been ecstatic. Like, oh my gosh, this is showing real progress. This is showing real promotion. Like, we are starting to see the representation of the world in the games that we love and what we're doing. So, but that's not the whole story, unfortunately. So, as Naomi mentioned at the top, myself and Matthew Kandaker co-founded Glow Up Games, where we decided that we wanted to change the industry. And Glow Up came about after a series of, I think what we can just call like cocktail conversations. Mithu and I were brunch buddies, we were friends. We would talk about the work we were doing. At the time, I was still at Disney and having a really fun time being executive there and just talking to folks about all the cool projects in the pipeline. Mithu was still at her last startup, Spirit AI, which was an AI tools and tech company. I think she was trying to work with Lucas on something. So we had a lot to just chit chat about over brunch and just talk about some of these issues that for some weird reason were not moving. Mithu had also given a rant at the Game Developers Conference in 2013 around, you know, we can talk about gender in games. We barely talk about gender in games. What about race? And so, you know, we had quite a bit to say, particularly as, you know, women of color who rarely ever saw ourselves represented in games. And even in 2019, at the time we were having a lot of these conversations. I believe there was a piece that came out in Quartz that quoted the head of Game Heads, which is a nonprofit that tries to get more, you know, kind of diverse teenagers into game development. And the lead of Game Heads was like, well, if I was an African-American woman, if I want to play as a Black female character, I have 19 options. So I was like, okay, well, we've increased by 4, we're net 4. I think now it'd be a few more, like counting a couple of games that have come out recently, so we might be at like 22, 23. But if you think about it, the course of 40 plus years of, you know, interactive game development as entertainment, it's still a really huge gap in terms of, you know, the number of white guys that I've been, like just so many white guys. I can't count the number of white men that I have been, but also non-human objects. I've been spores, I've been dogs, I've been, you know, Prince of the Cosmos. I've been all kinds of things in games. And it's interesting that there's this assumption that you can relate to these non-human characters more easily than you can relate to someone who is Black or someone who is of color. And so that's always been something that stuck out. And, you know, as I think as both of us worked in our careers and kind of climbed the various, well, for me, it was the corporate ladder. For Mitsu, kind of like doing an indie studio and figuring out those things, we realized that this changes was not coming. And so we decided to come together and start Glow Up Games. And initially, we had talked about AR games, actually, because that's where a lot more of my interest was. And that's where Mitsu had done her PhD. And so that made sense. But through the gaming grapevine, we had some friends who were writing for a Game of Thrones game for HBO. And they were like, oh, are you guys looking for a team to do Insecure? Well, Latoya and Mitsu are doing a thing. Why don't you reach out to them? So before we had a business, before we had a business name, any of these things, we got a call from our amazing partner at HBO, Will Price, who was like, hey, we're searching for a studio that might want to take on one of our IPs. Do you think you could do it? And then things just kind of accelerated from there. And so, you know, one of the things that, I mean, there's many things that stand out about Glow Up, besides the fact that, you know, we're women of color founded, but also that we assembled this very diverse team kind of from the jump. And a lot of folks, again, you guys will recognize from the NYU Mafia. So there should be some familiar faces down there. There's more people that we actually need to add because we've increased staff since this slide was created. But the idea was that we wanted a studio that was diverse from the ground up and that it wasn't just lip service. We weren't trying to get one token person in. We wanted to kind of really reflect the type of talent that's currently on the market and to reflect the type of people who make and play games ourselves. And so, you know, we've assembled a really fabulous team from, you know, Ethan Red, who has done the art and technical direction. As we said, Anango Lumumba Kasongo, who is AKA Samus, that's her rap name, who is our audio director, also just a badass professor in her own right. Johnny Liu, who just recently joined the team as our director of monetization and insights. Geneva Hayward, who was one of our first interns, who is now a part-time programmer with us. So it's been awesome for them to grow with our company. And then Owen Bell and Yusuf Cole, who was coming in on a different project. So we just, you know, it's interesting because anytime we try to hire at Glow Up, there's never a lack of applicants, particularly a lack of applicants of color. We generally have way more people that we want to hire than we have jobs that are available. But it's interesting to when we started thinking about the normal excuses for why we don't see diversity in studios, why we don't see the representation that we're looking for. That people are like, it's just too hard to assemble a team, when at this point it's teams multiple times over. It's something that we also used to say at the Undefeated, where we were like, there's not a Black journalist shortage, right? Like, you know, the people who applied to be here, we could staff 6 different newsrooms. So it's not the talent shortage. So what is the thing that is driving this? So just a quick one on why we started Glow Up. There were just a lot of things that we had no idea about when we started. We were very optimistic in the first couple of years, pre-pandemic, pre-everything, that we were just like, all right, we got this awesome IP, we have this awesome partner, we can find a publisher, it's not going to be a big problem. And there were so many gaps, and the first and the largest one we hit was data, which was very shocking to me coming from, you know, entertainment and from sports and from media, where, you know, Nielsen makes sure that there's demographic information, spending power, buying habits, participation for almost any category that you could ask for, any way you want to slice your data. And when it came to games, it was like, well, yeah, we have some stuff on gender and race we don't really do. We just don't do that. Okay, interesting. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, what does that mean? And then what does it mean if you're trying to prove out a concept like a studio that is geared toward underserved players or players that we know what we're calling essentially the largest hidden market in games. And so that was one of the big talking points that we had, particularly for investment, was that women of color love gaming, but in a $77 billion global market, there just isn't content geared toward us. And even when you think about things like Google had done a study in partnership, I believe, with Newzoo around kind of just female representation, which again, they do actually track, measure, and look at that globally. So you can get information about gender a lot easier than you can get information about race. And so when we looked at that study, they realized that women drive about 70% of spending in the mobile market. We are the power users in that sector. Now we also drive, you know, just about half spending in all other markets too. It's not at this point, it's not small numbers anywhere, but in the mobile market in particular, women are dominant. And what they even found was that of the top, I think 100 icons in the App Store that were representing like the top 100 games, only 8 or so had any kind of female appearing avatar. Everything else was male or non-human. And so we're seeing that pattern repeating and repeating and repeating. And then when you extrapolate that out to something as difficult to parse as essentially like a racial dynamic, which changes from country to country, which has places of different histories, different ideas, different language around it. It's something the games industry just chose not to look at. But as a result, we got this weird two-sided question, right? Which is like, well, we can't really prove that this market doesn't exist, but can you prove to us that it does exist? Can you prove to us women of color play too? Can you prove to us that they actually spend money in games? And so that was kind of an uphill battle. And we realized that there was this huge opportunity to actually monetize these players that were essentially being ignored. So yeah, I'd already mentioned that women drive 70% of the spending. We know that's about $55 billion. And then again, this is like pre-COVID numbers. So like now we have the new numbers for COVID. We need to like re-estimate all this stuff. And we realized that again, with an absence and complete absence of data, there really is no way to calculate what people are doing because we're basically extrapolating data that other industries have collected. So like the movie industry will sometimes look at people's phone usage or app usage as something that is competitive, and they'll put that out there, but it's not necessarily the same way that the industry would track it. And so, we came with this idea that possibly women of color are worth about $5 billion looking at other types of consumer spending. So to give you a sense, in the United States, and this is like just basic Nielsen data, in the United States, Black women consumer power is estimated at like $500 million, or essentially half of 1 trillion. Women actually control 52% of spending in the Black community, and that's in the Black community alone. There's also cultural ideas and cultural instincts of like the things that become very, very popular, the things that translate around the globe to be global trends. A lot of them are originating from the Black community. So there's this idea of, again, it's not being tracked. No one can prove how much it is. And so when we're trying to figure out, what's the stake in the market, that's where we're looking. Here we go. So we decided that we wanted to create essentially a platform that connects this diverse audience of players with the ecosystem of games. We're starting with our own game, so Insecure the Come Up game, and another project that we'll be announcing very shortly, that's looking at both diverse stories and culturally informed game mechanics. I think there are many different books we could write about our journey at Globe Games. I think one of my favorites is this assumption that women don't do hard tech and women don't like complex game mechanics. This idea that we're all just playing match 3. That's all we ever like. Anything that's too complicated, no one's going to pick up. There's no reason to invest in anything with a complex mechanic. So when we really set out to approach how we design something for Insecure, which is at that time when HBO approached us, was the second most socially engaged with show after Game of Thrones. And it was one of the places where all kinds of people, women of color in particular, but there's a substantial white audience, a substantial male audience for Insecure because they could all relate to the different things that we're seeing on screen. And Issa's very unique style of rapping at herself in the mirror when she needs to feel hyped up or when she needs to recover from a setback or something like that in life was something we wanted to turn into a game mechanic. So that's been really, really fun to just work on and do. So these are just some stills and a few shots from the game itself. So the game is still in progress. It'll launch roughly around the time that season 5 comes back. Everything's been disrupted by COVID. So it looks like they're pegging it toward fall of 2021. So you'll start seeing early access a little bit before then, and then it'll go from there. But we just wanted to show just like a sampling of the things in which we wanted to incorporate. We wanted to have that same kind of voicey, interesting, and very, quite frankly, South LA Black voice that they do so well on the show, and making sure that came through in the narrative design, in the character design, again, beautifully done by Ethan Red. We wanted to make sure that the likenesses were on point, that these were outfits that people would actually wear. We kind of jokingly call this the white party look of what's going on. And then just figuring out how are ways in which we would interact naturally in these types of environments. So just a little sneak peek there. So as a creator, I realized once I got in here, game development is really alchemy. It's kind of scientific, not really. And you're really spending a lot of time asking, how do we combine our skills to turn this chunk of lead into gold here? And frequently it's still just lead. Like it actually doesn't work out, because if game design was a science, if it was kind of a series of inputs and outputs that could be repeatable, then we would see a lot more successes, right? Like Cyberpunk had so much money, so much experience, much time. How could that have happened, right? There are so many games that have failed to launch, never launched. The book Blood, Sweat, and Pixels is a really beautiful example of this, where it's like, these are $76 million budget games that don't come out, that fail. So game development is a lot more kind of luck and hope than it felt like from the outside. And some of it does kind of directly relate to the diversity problems that we see in the industry. A big part of it is just the margins on game development. The margins are extremely tight. It's very difficult to get funding. Games are seen as kind of like the riskiest endeavor. So at one point I'm going to make for another type of talk, more about the business side of games. I'm going to make a little Venn diagram that's kind of like what venture capitalists hate funding. And it's going to be like, women-fronted companies that I think received last year 2.6% of all venture capital. And then you have like Black-fronted companies, which received less than 1%. If you look at Black women-fronted companies, it's like 0.6% of all venture capital. And then you have game studios, which venture capitalists are generally like, no. And here's Globe Games like right in the middle. So there were quite a few challenges to doing this. And one of the big things is that, you just generally tend to run out of capital. It's very, very difficult to launch a game on time. It's very difficult to do these things and amass the resources because it's such a risk. And so a lot of times you're grabbing your friends who don't really mind being broke for a few years to try to make this project happen with you. And if your friend group isn't diverse, you're going to start seeing the same types of folks, the same type of stories over and over again. And so, when I started thinking about game development as alchemy, and again, like thanks to people like, like Clara, who again, NYU Mafia, who's also helping to consult on the game, with narrative design, and I realized a lot of the questions I had as an outsider, where I was like, well, I don't know what I'm doing because I've never made a game before. She was like, there's actually no answer, Latoya, to some of these things. You just have to kind of do it, and that's what goes. And I'm like, game design is such a strange field. Like if I want to be a screenwriter, books behind me on the shelf of just like, here's the art of screenwriting. At this point, I've written radio scripts, documentary scripts, movie scripts, news broadcast scripts, all kinds of stuff. And they all follow like a similar format. Like you can learn it, you can teach it. There's classes on every street corner in LA. There's master classes. You kind of just sign up for one, understand the format, break it down, and then you figure out how you bring your own voice to it. And then when I came to game design, it was just like anarchy. It was just like, well, here's what worked for this. We wrote this one in some spreadsheets. Here's a Google Doc with some barks and some lines. Maybe that'll work. We don't know. Here's how they write for episodes. They also pay kids to write it. We don't know. Like no one really had a set, like this is how this goes. So it was like, okay. So it is a lot more kind of like merging of luck and skill and talent and trying to create something out of it. So this is actually a gift from Full Metal Alchemist, which is and now old anime that I really, really like. Because, in typical anime fashion, a lot of it is about two boys and their quest to be better alchemists for various reasons. Not to spoil if anybody hasn't watched it, but it's also about kind of coping with loss and grief and growing up. And so it's a really interesting series. And so the more I started thinking about the game design as alchemy metaphor, the more I found myself thinking about Full Metal Alchemist, and particularly what they call kind of like the first law of alchemy or equivalent exchange, and what they say in the series, which is that humankind cannot gain anything without first giving something in return. To obtain something of equal value must be lost. That is alchemy's first law of equivalent exchange. And this is the speech. This is from Full Metal Alchemist, the original series, not Brotherhood. And so it's in Alphonse's mouth. They also have a different version of the speech that goes in Brotherhood. It's a whole thing. Anyway. But this idea of equivalent exchange is really interesting to me because, again, in alchemy, you can't just transmute into anything that you want. It has to be more or less the same. If you have 1 gram of one material, you're not going to come out with 5 grams of something else. If you are trying to take something or do something forbidden, something really great will be lost. This idea of loss was really starting to resonate with me, particularly as I think about how the games industry is structured, right? So there's this idea that we're trying to take this lead and turn it into gold pretty frequently, but we're always ending up with lead. And you end up with lead in so many different ways. If your game fails, if it can't find the market that you're looking for, if it's not marketed properly, if it's just lost in the app store, there's 8 million ways that your game doesn't make it to the gold standard. What we also see, though, in this interesting idea of loss is the idea of diversity in games, right? Because as long as we have been talking about this issue, and I think some organizations have been at this about 20 years, trying to advance diversity in gaming. And we're still at these very abysmal numbers. I think the last IGDA survey, which again is incomplete data. So you start trying to look for stuff and there's more holes and more questions generally. But the last IGDA developer survey, which is kind of the industry standard, has women developers at about 22% of the industry. And again, that doesn't break you down into C-suite representation, doesn't break down into ownership, doesn't look at necessarily leadership, just kind of like, do you identify as a game developer, whatever level that may be, whatever discussion that may be. So that's 22%, which again, leaves the 88% as people who are essentially male identified. I believe they have another category that is 2% as well. I believe they say that's kind of like non-binary other is what they've termed it at in the most recent one, but I'll go back and double check. So that's, that is already an abysmal number. And then when you look at Blacks, not African-American, because African-American would be the specific cultural tradition from here from the US. I'm talking about folks from the Caribbean, folks in the UK, globally as to where they survey for IGDA. Globally, we're looking at less than 2%. Some estimates are less than 1%. Like, this is a pathetic number. This doesn't make any sense, particularly looking at the amount of young Black kids who are playing games. And it's the same thing that I wrote in the piece about esports, understanding that it's not a lack of a player base, it's not a lack of desire, it's not that people don't want to go into these careers. These paths don't seem to emerge, and then when we come here, we rain out so much faster. And I think a useful way to think about this is that, like Alchemy, trying to get to a diverse outcome is actually not an exact science, right? You don't just pour more material into one and it automatically comes out the other end with what you're looking for. So in a lot of ways, these diversity initiatives you see targeting high school students, front of the pipeline, teenagers, you're pouring a lot of money and resources in, but you're still not getting out folks who are staying in the industry longer than 5 years, which is what it takes to become a veteran here. People who are moving up the ranks at different games companies, folks who are in senior positions enough to make decisions or have leadership potential. You're still not seeing those outcomes, even though they're putting those in. And at the same time, a lot of solutions around diversity tend to be additive. Like, we can just do more here. We can add, well, normally we're not adding money, but we'll get to that in a minute. But we can add more effort or more mentoring or more something else. And then what'll come out the other side is this great pipeline for us to use. But if you think about it as loss, right? To gain something, something equivalent must be lost. You can think about the cost of games and game development in a very different way. We talk a lot about labor in games, and since when was EA Spouse? EA Spouse, that was, I believe, 2008, 2009, where EA Spouse wrote their letter exposing these harsh practices at the EA studio broadly across developers, this mandatory crunch time, things like that. And started the labor reforms that EA eventually had to, hold themselves to as a publicly traded company, which is interesting. But this idea that the human cost of creating games is fine to pay. It's okay to force people into crunch time forever and ever, amen, because you wanted to be in this glamour industry. It's okay to outsource the stressful parts of labor to places in Southeast Asia, places in Eastern Europe, where the labor is so much cheaper. And we don't look at those costs, right? It was interesting because CD Projekt Red talked about like just the grueling and horrifying conditions that people were working under to create and try to ship Cyberpunk, which was ultimately kind of panned. They had to do all of these. It was a rare mea culpa from an industry. And the focus wasn't, they were like, okay, we're not going to do any more crunch time, guys. It's going to be over. Okay, wait, we lied. So this human cost is really, really high. And that's before you start looking at the toll of things like, okay, who is the system designed for? Is the system designed for parents, right? I'm a parent of a young child, my son is 7. And just trying to be in game development as a parent is extremely challenging. I watched the GDC talk where they were like, yeah, that's game dev on hard mode. Like you don't want to go in there because it's an industry that's kind of built and constructed around the needs of people that they feel like are young and disposable, that you can just mine through and grind through game developers. I will never forget my first IGDA. So it's one of 3 women that went. A friend organized, we all drove down to the IGDA in Hunt Valley. And so it was just the 3 of us and then a room full of men. and we were talking to them, and they just had these like, you know, I had these very romantic dreams of game development. This was been, God, 2006, 7, something in there. They had these really romantic dreams of what it was like to work in the games industry. And they were all like, yeah, we sleep under the desk. Like, I still live with my parents. I make $35,000 a year. Like, it was just a really tough thing to think about in terms of what the cost is for creating a game. So when you think about labor, when you think about the ways in which people perceive value of the things that they're doing, of what people create, of the costs associated with it. Because normally we do talk about, you know, investment cost, how much a game costs to make versus how much it actually made at the in the consumer market. We talk about other types of values, but we don't really normally talk about the human toll and the human cost. And especially not when we talk about the ways in which structures may have evolved to serve one type of person or one specific type of worker and not necessarily anyone else. This problem is not unique to games. You know, I write quite a bit about the tech space in particular, and why, you know, after spending billions and billions of dollars each year, we're just not seeing the same kind of outcomes in technology, you know, that relate to the amount being spent trying to solve this problem, right? And so, you know, this is $275 million, which is the amount Google, just Google, not anybody else, not IBM, not Oracle, not Facebook, no one. Google spent on DEI initiatives in 2014 and 2015. So it's just 2 different years. And for less than a 2% increase in their overall minority hires. All right, this has been a standing issue with large technology companies, that they cannot hold talent, they cannot retain talent, and they keep trying to dump more and more money in the front part of this pipeline. And they keep going, wait, I put in all this gold, how come I still have lead? I keep putting in all this gold, how come I still have lead? And a big part of that is not examining systems that would drive people out or get people to fall out of these trends. So it's interesting, there was a wonderful piece on Medium about diversity in tech, the endpoint problem that we look at. I actually use a lot of particularly game design research, particularly Betsy DeSalvo's research, who's now at Georgia Tech, around kind of like race and play practices, and looking at the things that she uncovered about a decade ago with her PhD study, and how similar a lot of those patterns still are now to problems broadly in computer science, but also in the games industry at large. And so in this piece, in Diversity in Tech, one of the things that they point out is something that we keep seeing over and over again, which is that there's similar trends to the money that these companies devoted to internal efforts. A lot of the time, it's not publicized where this money goes. They talk a lot about, oh, we care about diversity. We're going to put more money toward it. We're going to put $100 million in. We're going to put $25 million in. We're going to put $5 million in. But there is no follow-up, and the money is often not put toward internal efforts for diversity, which is really, really strange, right? Again, tech companies. So like, you know, when I was working in artificial intelligence, I went to a talk by one of like MIT's premier scientists, and he was going, you know, to make self-driving cars work, all we have to do is rethink how people walk. And this man laid out like a 50-year plan on redesigning cities to change how people walk around so that self-driving cars could operate without kind of like the pedestrian risk that is currently preventing them from being on the road. And they had a whole game plan. 50 years from now, cities will look like this. This is how it's going to feel. And I was just like, if you ask these same people, can they hire more Black engineers? They're like, this is impossible. Like, they would rather change how people walk, change how cities are designed, do a global scale reboot. But diversity, still impossible. Impossible. So I thought about that a lot, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter. So, you know, Mitchell and I decided to start a studio at kind of like the greatest time to do so. On top of the usual risk of a game studio, we also had COVID-19, a worldwide pandemic, the likes of which none of us had seen in 100 years. None of us were alive for generally the Spanish flu. And so here we are trying to make this little game as the global economy is drying up. And then on top of that, there's uprisings in the street like every freaking week. Now, it's not like this wasn't something that's going on since Ferguson happened in 2012, back when again, I was in newsrooms. Since Ferguson, every summer, there are these extrajudicial killings and shootings that were outside of the system. Every summer, the names changed. But you were starting to see this outpouring and outcry of like, why is this not changing? And in the wake of this, more and more companies were like, you know what? Let's create a statement. Let's talk. Let's get in front of this. Let's figure this out. So if you look at what happened in games, right? in the games industry. So we had this abysmal number, particularly around African-American participation in the industry. We were at less than 2%. And all of these statements, now there's a lot of people who stayed silent, which we can also do an entire talk on, but we're going to just focus on the folks who at least said something. So all of these different statements, we stand in solidarity with the Black community. We stand in solidarity with our Black team. We're talking to our ERG. Words are not a myth. Anti-racism matters. Nintendo shares the pain. What did all of these have in common? Just like the criticism of mainstream tech organizations, they also, in terms of like the part of the universe they control, which is video games and pop culture representation, actually did very little and put that money away toward like these other actors, somebody else who can help solve this. Let's look at, you know, let's donate to Black Lives Matter. Let's donate to the NAACP. Let's donate to color lines, which is great. I love color lines, right? I worked for them way back in the day too. But this idea that, again, they can make a statement, and a lot of places it didn't even bother to do that, but they can make a statement, but not think that they needed to change something in their own systems to get a different type of outcome. So again, we're talking about this weird alchemy, right? This equivalent change. What are you willing to lose to have this other thing happen? If we want a more equitable games community, if we want a more equitable games industry, what would have to be lost to do so? And Keita Jackson, who was writing for Waypoint and Vice, just kind of put a really fine point on it, asking, how am I supposed to believe EA is delaying its Madden announcement because it cares about Black lives when it censored Kaepernick's name in a song in their last game? I'm happy to see and hear the solidarity, but the games industry has to clean its own house too and admit that it's part of the problem. So one of these things, again, like Naomi and I have been talking about this issue for years and years and years on end. And one of the things that we just keep seeing surface is the idea that it's just a really hard problem to solve. It's so hard. But at what point have people tried to change their reactions? Now, the notable exception here is Niantic. And it's interesting because there was some reporting, I believe, by Evan Gatch from Kotaku that did the roundup on kind of what every single games company that created a statement said, a Kotaku follow-up statement, and then where do they put the money? Which is, again, a question everyone in the room should ask themselves. When you hear about these big splashy things, we're going to help Black developers, we're going to fund Black companies, we're going to start an initiative and a program, we're going to diversify our ranks. Just make a little note for yourself in the calendar 6 months from now. What happened? Was that money distributed? Where did that money go? All those different questions. So figuring those things out is part of the work of anti-racism, just tracing where all this stuff is starting to go awry. So we get this whole thing around with Niantic being kind of the exception that proves the rule, because Niantic actually did do a whole thing around what we're going to do in terms of changing. And so they eventually they donated X amount of money to Marsha P. Johnson. We donated this amount of money to the NAACP. We're going to take half of the money from Pokemon Go Fest. We're going to put this toward Developers Fund, which is now called the Black Developers Initiative at Niantic, to help foster people working on our platform. And so they really thought about this. Trinidad Hermida and Akira Thompson are over there. They're fantastic, people and partners have been thinking through very deeply, how do you make something that makes a lot of sense? So that makes sense. Hi, Gavin. How do you do something that makes a lot of sense, that is working from where they are? But Niantic, once again, was the exception that proves the rule. So one of the things that I thought was just really interesting was that games revolve around system design, and racism is a system. So, very logically, particularly as I got into games deeper and deeper and realized how much of what is happening really runs off of a system, be it your monetization system, your item system, your scoring systems, the ways in which players move around, all those things are very explicitly designed. Your first time player experience, which I had never even heard of before I went into game development, was your F2UE, all right? And then you're spending all this time looking at an undesired behavior and figuring out how to fix it. So you're like, oh, all our users are falling out right here at, minute 4 of our introduction. Let's redo our onboarding. Let's fix our tutorial. Oh, we can't get anybody past level 7. Okay, based on that input, let's go back and fix this. So it's amazing to me that when we talk about racism in the games industry, the people who are kind of the best equipped to dissect it and figure it out just kind of go, no idea, can't fix it, don't know how to do it. I don't know, did we give some money, something? We don't know. But racism is also a system. And again, it's a system that is very trackable, very, very trackable. So it's actually not alchemy in any way. Racism works and operates in very specific ways, but it does so in specific patterns that we have at this point taken apart from all different angles. You can look at almost anything, literally. I picked this book just because it's a new one that I'm really interested in, which is about the whiteness of wealth and about this woman, Dorothea Brown, who was interestingly in a lot of Republican administrations, who worked in the tax code, and she actually got into tax law because she felt like it'd be more equitable, right? She's like, it's numbers, right? I don't have to worry about racism with numbers. And then lo and behold, over her 25 years working in this, she started realizing that the tax system, even though it's supposed to be progressive and race blind, was actually putting an undue burden, particularly on Black Americans. And so, you know, she argues in this book, I mean, there's a huge Bloomberg article that's just fascinating. I read it open mouth. So highly recommend you guys read that if you want to look at, again, designs of systems outside of games that, you know, are working, maybe not as intended. No one said like, hey, we want to disadvantage Black people explicitly. But what ended up happening was it was a system that privileged white buyers, and particularly white single earning households, over everyone else. And time again, lawmakers and people in the tax code would revise the tax code based on the wishes of the white and wealthy, which led to all these inequities within the system, to the point where she writes that essentially a Black couple or a Black family and a white family earning the same amount of money, the Black family will still be paying more in taxes. So one example that she gives is that Brown argues that the tax policy magnifies insult to injury by magnifying the financial toll of Blackness, right? The tax treatment of housing is a textbook case. So again, when you start thinking about the systems of how our society runs, you can start seeing how these very small decisions started adding up to these huge inequalities that we're still facing to this day. Interest paid on mortgages is deductible, but there's no comparable perk for renters who are disproportionately Black. Also, white homeowners tend to pocket gains upon resale, which are largely tax-free. In contrast, Black homeowners are likely to lose money on their investment because homes don't usually appreciate much in diverse neighborhoods that are shunned by white buyers. Think about that for a second. You did what you're supposed to do. You bought a home. You bought a home in a Black area. That asset did not appreciate, and in fact depreciated, unless you live in a gentrifying neighborhood like I do in Washington, D.C., where suddenly all of these older African Americans are being able to be paid out from their homes because it is now kind of a beautiful target for gentrification. And losses on your home are not tax deductible. So there's some amazing work around this. There's also a piece that I was reading a few years ago on kind of like the construction of benefits and how they were made again to privilege men who generally had in-home support from wives, and the whole like institution of wife in the traditional sense. Someone at home to take care of your skills, which means those things are not things that are tax deductible, versus out of home entertainment expenses that you would get in the realm of work, which are deductible, which is why you can deduct expenses, strip club outings, boats, other things for client entertainment, but you can't deduct things like childcare in the same way. And this is fascinating. We start looking at and unpacking the systems that we start taking for granted. And so, you know, even here in Dorothea Brown's book, these are three different systems, right? How we've decided mortgages work, right? One. Two, how we talk about resale and tax gains on selling a property. And then three, kind of like the ways in which properties appreciate and depreciate. Oh yes, and then four, the whole idea of a renter and their value versus a buyer and their value. If we made the tax system a game, which people have done, there was a thing called Tax Hero, or Budget Hero, sorry. There was a game called Budget Hero. People got to do their state budgets, and that was actually an unexpectedly very popular Excel spreadsheet game. But there are games about this that are around understanding why these systems are happening the same way. So again, game design has the largest concentration of people who understand systems in the world, and yet we can't solve this. One of the things I find really interesting, particularly looking at other disciplines, is what happens when you look at a system and decide to revise it. Again, a very normal thing that we do in game development, which is the system is not working for a majority of our users. Let's fix it. Let's balance the game. Let's look at how we balance this level to make it more accessible. What are we doing? And so what's really interesting is that one of the co-founders of Blacks in AI, Racialicious, she is now over at Berkeley and working in their computer science program. And they have, again, abysmal outcomes for African-American students and Black students in computer sciences. But boom, 15% of the class this year is Black after Red started because they did one thing. They changed something in the system that was blocking people. They waived the GRE, which is interesting. Because normally you start getting these culture war conversations like, oh, you're reducing the standards and stereotypes, et cetera, et cetera. And we were like, well, does the GRE accurately measure the skills that we need for computer science? And Red was like, no, they waived it, 15%. So her quote is that the pipeline isn't leaky, academia keeps drilling holes into it. But that's something that we can keep seeing all over the map, from the games industry to the tech industry to, I mean, honestly, shipping and logistics. It's almost every single industry. This idea that we don't want to examine the systems that have been set up. We want to prefer to pretend that the outcome of racism is just some weird alchemical process that we have no control over, versus really going through and understanding, why are we seeing these gaps at all different levels of entertainment? How come we're not seeing people move to executives? How come we're not seeing the funding levels for entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs of color, at the same level as white entrepreneurs? There's a lot of questions you could ask and a lot of ways we could tune the system if we only cared to know. So anyway, so that is about my time. I think that gives us a little bit of time for questions as well. But I know we've covered a ton of topics. If you want to reach me, you can also hit us through Go Up Games, Latoya at Go Up Games as well. I'm also easy on Twitter at Latoya Peterson. And normally really happy to talk shop, talk about games with you. If you are a young developer, I will probably just follow you back just because I'm interested in what you're doing. So anyway, that is me. Thank you so much for the time.
All right, thank you so much, Latoya. I cannot tell you the rush of different emotions that went over me, and I think a lot of people in chat as we were listening to you. Yeah, I don't know. I went from all the way from like feeling so happy that you're here to having like rush of nostalgia to being like, oh, yep, it's that same goddamn thing again. And then also just feeling incandescent rage, you know, like we talk enough about these inequities, and it just makes us really mad. So yeah, we've had a request to slow down the pace of
I forgot to warn y'all, I'm out of radio now, so nobody tells me to talk slower anymore. So my bad.
I talk too fast also, so we'll try to talk a little slower for the captioner. But if you guys in chat, if you have questions, I'm going to be looking at chat. I'll filter those questions and ask Latoya. I did notice one thing that came up in chat that I thought was really crucial that I wanted to get your thoughts on right away. I think it was a Danger Chunk in chat was talking about back in the last summer, when all of those Black Lives Matter statements were coming out, right? There were also these big lists of Black artists, Black devs that were sort of circulating around, and all of a sudden, like all these people were getting all of this attention that they weren't prepared for. And I don't know, like, yeah, I want to get your, so you are a very seasoned, you know, writer and artist, and like a person who's used to being in the spotlight. What you must have watched that happen. And like, especially for a lot of people who are sort of newer to creative industries, I don't know, like, how do you even navigate that kind of situation where there's this like, oh, I want to give you a ton of work, and then suddenly you're in crunch mode, but then like what happens when that stuff evaporates? Like it's like a sudden trend, right? And then all these people ghost or like just don't really follow up on commitments. It's just so frustrating.
Yeah, visibility, and particularly the hyper visibility of minorities in this industry is definitely a gift and a curse in some ways. And I'll talk about the curse part first, so it's easier to see, where it's like, yes, suddenly you're trending, right? And it's like, oh, we should absolutely hire somebody Black for this position. Wow, why didn't we think of this before? Novel, right? Let's get a woman in here. Now, that's to leave aside concepts like the glass cliff, where they hire a woman in when everything has failed and she's getting kicked to the end of this cliff, like, oh, well, maybe you can work it out. If not, it's going to stink anyway. Who cares? Right? We'll do that. It's never really like, you're never coming from a position of strength in that way. So that can be tough. But then also there's this, what we've learned from Black creatives in television in particular, and what we learned from kind of like, there was a big, huge sitcom renaissance in the 90s, all these Black shows with all this amazing stuff. You'd turn on any channel and you would get all of these like great Black creator-led Black talent shows. And then they all just evaporated. And you're like, well, what happened? And it wasn't like the audience died or anything. It was that, you know, executives stopped funding it. That was it. And you're like, you know, this isn't profitable for us anymore, or we just don't want to do it. What happened?
At least Will Smith got his career out of that.
Yes. Well, I mean, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, there was like, just thinking back, I was like, dang, okay, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Family Matters, The Parenthood, The Parent Trap, right? My Wife and Kids. Like, there were so many people in that like 10-year span that came through. I mean, of course, like Martin. There was so much stuff that happened. And then suddenly executives were just like, the trend was over. Oh, do we need Blacks anywhere? No, we don't, we're launched, we're good. We don't need this. And so you saw this gap until about 2017, 2018, where these things started taking off again. They realized, oh, hey, the only thing that's really holding up our infrastructure here is our diverse stories and diverse names. Let's go find more folks. And so what you see from a lot of Black creators is that they understand the boom and bust cycles of the industry. And they're like, when you're hot, you've got to cash in, you just got to go, because you never know when it's going to come again. And that is really frustrating. So like, even like the director, I believe, of New Jack City, he's fantastic, as well as the director of Love Jones. Both of them have been trying to make sequels to their movies for 20 years. The funding never comes together. So it's, you know, it's a thing where it's really exhausting and overwhelming. And the other thing that you want to avoid, particularly like when I was a young writer, one of the big things that I had to very intentionally step away from for a while is writing about race, right? Like when I was a writer, I loved writing about these dynamics, but I didn't want to just be the race writer. You know, these are systems that are much broader and that have a lot more stuff. I wanted to write about economics. I wanted to write about, you know, structural foundations. I wanted to write about technology. And what will happen is if you make your career and all of your work and portfolio is about your identity, you end up getting pigeonholed into just that spot. And so when it's not an identity project, they don't call you and they don't consider you for the next promotion or consider you for a studio lead for your work. You are now in this niche category. So I think it's really tough because it's just that also, again, with the explosion of the internet, like things, being a creator is so much more competition now that you're trying to get any kind of differentiator and you're pushing all of those things to the forefront, but it can very quickly become a double-edged sword, particularly as like a lot of the young influencers are seeing. You even see this in like streamer culture where, you know, a lot of the top Black streamers are folks who have, you know, under 20,000 subs who are not making the money of what you would see an equivalent white streamer doing. Same thing that we see in esports, where it's like, you know, someone who loves the FGC and spends 30 hours a week, 40 hours a week in practice, it's just not going to make the money of someone who's in, who's doing League or Dota or one of those other more traditional ones, or one of the more PC games specifically, because the money is not there in the same way. And so it's the way things break, but it's also just highly problematic. And one of the things I think you learn as a creative is that you are a product for better or for worse in terms of the work that you sell versus what you keep for yourself. And so you kind of have to learn to negotiate again these boom and bust periods because you don't know when they're going to come.
Yeah, the comparison with television and to some extent movies also like strikes me as so interesting because of those. There are these sort of like boom and bust cycles, and yet you get the sense that there are some professionals who've really like made a foothold, right? You have like the people like Shonda Rhimes who are like, yeah, like you can do a Grey's Anatomy, and then she.
But what happened to Shonda? But what happened to Shonda?
Yeah, no,
Shonda got played out by an executive that thought she wasn't worth an extra Disney pass, which as a person that worked there, when we all get 2 free passes, and there's a bunch of extra ones too, it's $154. They couldn't give Shonda Rhimes $154. $154. And she took herself to Netflix. Okay, like, so, you know, in a lot of ways, I really love what Shonda has built, but it's like, don't think that all these other awesome creatives of color who feel like they made it got played. Ryan Coogler. Black Panther was a box office miracle. Like, that thing is a juggernaut. Why don't we see more Black Panther projects in the pipeline? Why aren't we seeing that investment come back? Why are all of the folks who worked on Judas and the Black Messiah talking about how hard it was to get that film made with Ryan Coogler putting up half the money? Like, this is stuff that is inconceivable.
Yeah, no, for real.
Inconceivable.
And yet, do you feel like are video games like not even there, not even to that point? That's sort of what it feels like when I look at it. I'm like, we don't even have Ryan Coogler's, and you know,
No.
we're not elevating like the black devs and creatives in the game industry who should be our Ryan Coogler's and Shonda Rhimes, even if those people are going to get, you know, dogged by asshole executives at some point. I'm like, yeah, why is it just that games is further behind because we're an immature medium? That's like our eternal excuse, right? Oh, but we're just babies.
Yeah,
or is it something else? Like, what is it about games?
I feel like games is one in a midlife crisis. So like games is 40. Like
yeah, we're the 40. Yeah, 40. That's true. Yeah,
might be
we can say that, right? Yeah, we're 40.
We're 40. We're 40. Yeah. Like it's a little. But I mean, like, yeah. So there's some of that. There's also just kind of like just the amount of systemic exclusion is hard, because it's interesting because like there's all this fight about like the terms that you use, because the terms you use are important, right? And it's like, do you say marginalized or do you say historically excluded? Like, what do you say? Because they're both true. It's both the same situation. It's which way are you framing it? And so I think in games, you haven't seen that type of change for a variety of reasons, mostly because they've been able to kind of like limp along on this weird little tricycle and not, you know, not have to really analyze why something works. That's kind of interesting and specific to game development that I've seen. It's kind of like an exploding circus all the time. And it's just, this worked at this point then, and I made a whole bunch of money, and just don't ask any more questions. I think there's also the piece of it where, quite frankly, games is afraid of other types of narratives. They just don't want to see it. The folks who are in power, the folks that have done this for a long time, have also felt like they're very counterculture. They're very different than other people, be it because we're geeks or because of this or that. And anything else is like a threat to that identity, a threat to that reality. You see this also in kind of gaming audiences, where it's like suddenly if everyone's a gamer, I'm not special, therefore let's start drawing some lines here so everybody knows who's real and who's fake. So you see that same dynamic as well. There's also the weird tendency, I talk to Mitsu about this all the time, where on one side, on the critic side, we talk about cinema envy a lot. And we go, hey, like, you know, games don't have to be movies. It's not the form that we have to follow. It's a different type of entertainment medium. We don't need to keep thinking we need to be like movies to be legitimized. But when you look at the gaming funding landscape, a lot of people are like, I made my money in games and now I'm going to go invest in films. And I'm like, I cannot think of like a film producer that'd be like, I made my money in films and I'm never going to touch another film again because it's risky. I'm going to go invest in like video games or some other project.
It's like some type of class climbing.
Yeah, it's a really strange, like, because video games don't have that prestige yet.
Right.
As a prestige art form for 8 million reasons, particularly how we understand types of art and how we understand kind of collective experiences. But there's not that prestige there. And so you have this real gap. Like, there's a lot of folks who've made money in entertainment who are Black. But like when Mitsu and I were looking for, again, like Black board members, one, so people who are like C-suite or higher at different companies. And then two, other Black funders, the conclusion is what? Most of us have not made our money in games. People aren't familiar with it. They tend to invest in stuff they're familiar with. And people who are there tend to open more doors. I mean, we're working with Issa Rae. Issa Rae at this point has gotten her entire squad deals with HBO. Prentice Penny has an overall deal. Natasha Rothwell, who plays Kelly, has an overall deal. Her homegirl, I'm blanking on her name, but she, Robin Thede. Robin Thede has a Black Lady sketch show. Like almost all of her friends have now also gotten deals. She's gotten a huge deal. All the folks who are with her, so like Thug Yoda from her first series is now on Insecure. All of those folks were able to come up because of one creator, right? And she has brought all those folks with her.
It's real.
And that has not happened in games yet.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll just keep crossing our fingers. Okay. I have to stop monopolizing your time because I've gotten questions from people in chat and we only have 7 minutes left. So here's an important one from Danger Chunk. Thinking about the future of these topics, who are some up and coming devs that you're currently watching and you see continuing the work that you've been doing for so long? Like, you want to give any shout outs?
Continuing. which work are you referring to, my darling? Because I haven't shipped a game yet, so that's already like sketchy territory.
The thinking about games, whether inside or outside or writing or making.
Absolutely love the Game Devs of Color Expo, in part because, I mean, oh yeah, this is you too, Naomi. So way back in the day, Naomi was like, hey, Latoya, you want to be on this panel at Indie Game, which I had never been to. And she put me on this panel with Sean Alexander Allen, Kat Small, Ashley Acelia,
Oh
Charlene,
yeah, Ashley,
yeah,
everybody was
Charlene
there.
Holmes,
That's true.
and I'm forgetting a person. Not Elaine Gomez, though I met her there as well. But anyway, all of these like amazing young devs who looked at me like, who is this corporate suit? Who is this ESPN bitch gonna walk up in here like she knows anything about video games? It was a tense couple of first meetings. They were like, who is this person? And then eventually I talked them out of it. And now they're all fantastic friends. And I love what they've been doing and the collectives that they've done. Kat in particular has done so much with Brooklyn Gamery, with Baby Castles. With before that, she had Code Liberation. I mean, like she is just a phenom. Rochelle Bazalis, who's fantastic. Elaine Gomez. Oh my God, I could just name like thousands of people. But basically, it's like these young devs who were just scrappy and were making new stuff. And then I discover new people all the time now, like thanks to being here and looking. So many more folks are now starting to peel off towards streaming. But I also just have a special place in my heart for folks who want to like get their hands dirty in like the making of.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I couldn't put it any better. All right, we got next question is from Versafied. When the AAA industry churns out talent and often has people moving away from big studios, trying to get away from AAA to start their own thing in indies, what should the industry overall be doing to support Black indies? So like, I guess what could all of us be doing to support Black indies that are coming out of that system?
So there's an entrepreneur named Tiffany Bell. Tiffany Bell does not work in games. She works in startups. And she just coined this little phrase that everybody who is Black seeking capital does that uses. Make the hire, send the wire. That's all you got to do. Cut the check, cut the check, cut the check. People do not get to make a game unless you help support them. Cut the check. You know who cuts the check? Ava Carr. That's who cuts the check, right? At this point, Prototype Fund, a Moonrise Fund at this point. She's amazing. But there's not enough people. There are people who are like, I'll mentor, I'll talk, I could share the stage, cut a check, particularly if you are a man and getting paid. Cut a check, because you probably got paid twice as much that somebody else got offered. And you don't realize this. This is something I didn't realize until I worked at ESPN either. Like all of my white homeboys were fantastic. Like, oh, we're all gamers, bros, what's up? Like it was all great. And they were talking to me like, why are they acting like this towards you? I'm like, oh yeah. I mean, this is my life. This is what it is. And they're like, wait, they're just not offering you a whole bunch of money? Like, what do you mean? Like, they are like, we see you working hard. I understand why this isn't working. Like for them, it's just mind blowing. Like, what is this? Right? For us, we're like, yeah. Twice as hard, half as far. We have the memo, okay? We all know what this is. But for a lot of white men, this is not obvious, particularly because no one treats them this way. So they've had to work in some way. But, there's things that other people are offered, a lot of us have to fight for half as much. And so understanding that, like there's a lot of folks who have told us in this journey, we would love to support developers of color. And then when we ask more questions, because, if they don't want to support us, it's fine. Like, investment is a personal thing in a lot of ways as well. But there's other game devs of color. There's an entire expo of game devs of color who are trying to get funded. And you
can find someone who you want to work with and support by investing in them. Yeah.
Eliminate everyone who's currently in the field in favor of this like imaginary, like there was one place that had like the Stardew Valley complex where they were like, well, we really just want to fund like somebody's love project. They've been working on their basement for 6 years. I was like, none of us have the institutional wealth to be doing nothing like that. Okay. Like also that dude was living off his girlfriend for 5 years. He hated his life by the time the game shifted. Like, did you read the story? It's not a fun existence. So like
what I'm looking for is a sad white man who just eats ramen and has just been working on one game while being supported by his girlfriend. That's what we really want to invest in.
And that's the other piece of it, right? Because it's also who gets the benefit of the doubt in investment. Because a lot of investment, like they try to make it sound very scientific, but a lot of it is just gut. And it's who do I trust, right? For a lot of times, like we just didn't look the part. It's like, oh, it's 3 girls trying to make me weird. Like, what is going on? Like, are y'all even in the tech? What is this? So this understanding of like the stereotypes that you carry of like, well, this person, they might not have it all together, but I feel like they can get there, trust. Versus, I feel like you need to prove a little bit more. So again, that Tiffany Bell, make the hire, send the wire. That's all you need. You don't need to talk about it no more. You don't have no more conversations. Pay somebody if you can. Make the hire, send the wire. Just do that.
And have some faith in people, right? And okay, we've got 1 minute left. And here's the last question. It's How can the folks here best support the work of Glow Up Games? And that comes from someone named Samus Music.
Oh, hey girl, what's up? So Sam is our audio director. Is like, how can we support Glow Up? I love it. So the way that you would support any creator of color, which is one, meaningfully engage with their work. Don't just be like, we want to see more Black and brown creators and then not go engage with the work. The best thing you can do for us is play the game, because we need to know that people actually want to play these kind of games. So you can talk about us when you get press, but that is not the same as clients, particularly people who are going to refer, share the game with their friends, do stuff. Also, trigger finger. I realized too, in this new economy of likes and follower counts and subs leading to more opportunities, that creators of color just have to work harder to get recognized. So benefit of the doubt, when you're scrolling past something that was fun or whatever, sub to that person, subscribe to that person, like that person's content, do something else, help them build their brand, because they are going to be automatically at a disadvantage. So those two things.
Well put. Thank you so much, Latoya. I'm sorry if I know there were a couple questions we couldn't get to, but we have to wrap it up there.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be around. Just tweet.
Yeah, just tweet at Latoya if you have more questions. And oh my God, thank you all for being here. Thank you for everyone who asked questions in chat and everyone out there watching. Big love for Latoya from everybody at the NYU Game Center and everybody watching. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Naomi.
Yeah, woo! We're back together again.
I know.
So, from 11 years ago to today.
Go. And may there be 10 more years, 11 more years. Let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks.
All right.
We'll just make that the end. Bye, everybody.
Night.